announcements. That's visitors. What's left? Oh, yeah, the sermon. That's me. That's my stuff. So, today's sermon. Do I have a title? Not really. Oh, yeah, Response and Honor. That's a good title, I guess. Short one. I really need to think about it. Yes, it is the one I gave you. No, I'm talking about, I need to get back to, my long titles, but no. Response and Honor. Boring, but accurate. So, that's today. So we're going to start out. I'm going to tell you of a story. It's a story of there was a time in a certain nation that where there was a national craze. So it came about that in this certain nation there was a large number of women throughout the nation, especially in these like women's groups and societies, and they all came together and they decided to stop eating sugar. That's right, sugar. No sugar for them, and it became a big social thing. They not only didn't eat sugar, they wanted other people not to see them not eating sugar. Sort of like vegans, or most vegans. And just like vegans today, many vegans today, not all vegans, Sarah, I love you. I love you, my darling. But not all vegans, but just like many vegans today, it became even a moral issue. Not eating sugar, they at least saw themselves as the morally justified, the morally upright people for not eating sugar. And so, if I just stop the story right there, you might come to certain conclusions. You might think that they were these holier-than-thou people. You might think that they were just so concerned with their waistlines and really trying to count the carbohydrates and the calories. But the truth is, none of that had anything to do with it. Sugar was the battle. It wasn't the war. See, this happened in England in the late 1700s. Some of you may know the story, especially if you've ever seen the movie. It was referenced in the movie Amazing Grace. You see, they were known as the anti-saccharides. These women's groups in England in the late 1700s, they stopped eating sugar because sugar was produced from sugarcane. And sugarcane was grown on plantations in the West Indies by slaves. They were abolitionists. And this was a way, this stop eating sugar was a way to protest slavery and to not be involved in it if they could stop. See, that's how things go sometimes. We think something's about one thing when in fact it's really about something totally different. And that's kind of a segue into our sermon today. Again, last week Darren talked about Sabbath and rest, and that theme is continuing on this week. And before I even get to the passage for today, though, I want to talk about for a moment. As many of us know, in the New Testament times, starting in Jesus' time and then during Jesus' life and following on after his death and resurrection, his followers, there are two main conflicts or controversies that they faced. During Jesus' life, Jesus lived his life in Palestine, in Judea, and one of the main controversies or main conflicts that he had with in Palestine, where he lived amongst other Jews, a majority of people who were members, at least surface level members of the covenant. The conflict was about Sabbath. But after Jesus' death and resurrection, his followers carried the gospel into the Roman Empire, into what's known as the diaspora of Jews, where Jews were still present, but they were the minority. And the main conflict that they faced in those areas was circumcision. So we read this in the New Testament, and we can often think that these conflicts, they're about one thing, when in fact I think they're kind of something a little bit different. You see, we often think they're about rules, about, here are these Jews that were just so stuck on following the law, and they just couldn't see any other way. And one of the reasons we think that is because we don't have a lot of good context for why they were so concerned with these two things. I mean, of all the issues of faith, these two kind of seem a little bit low on the priority scale. When it comes to things like, we see them that way. I mean, Sabbath is a good thing. Rest, yeah, that's good. But it seems less important than something like do not murder or be kind and love one another. It seems a whole lot less important than those things. And circumcision especially so. We don't, practice circumcision, at least not for the same reasons as the Jews. So why were these such big conflicts back then? Well, let's start out with the Sabbath. So Sabbath, that is, there it is. All right, so Sabbath came about. It is in the law, and they were commanded to observe the Sabbath actually in two different places. As we know, they were commanded within the Ten Commandments, and the Ten Commandments are given twice in the Old Testament. So in the first time, and that's important because it's not worded the same way in both of these places. Both places say to observe the Sabbath, but they don't give the same reason. So we're going to look at both of them. So in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, it says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So, it says, observe the Sabbath. But what is the reason? The reason is because God created the earth in 6 days, and then on the seventh he rested. It's interesting. God rested. It's not that we aren't to rest purely for our sake, but we rest because God rested. So why did God rest? That seems to be a relevant question. A pretty philosophical one, too, over the centuries. Why did God, the God of the universe, ever have to rest? So we're going to answer that. We're going to go to Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3. So, set this up, as we know, in the first chapter of Genesis are the first 6 days of creation. It's pretty famous now. We're not going to go through them, but as we all know, came the first day, evening and morning and evening, and then the first day, he brought, light and darkness and dry land from the sea and all this good stuff happened over the first 6 days. And then the seventh day, when it comes to the seventh day, we get to this. So in Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3, it says, Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So, seems pretty straightforward. God finished and he rested. But it seems straightforward, but why does a biblical author focus on it so much? It seems pretty focused on. He repeats it 3 times, or there's 3 lines about this, and he's really drilling down on this. Why does it seem so important? Well, the first thing we need to think about is the word rested. It's not so much a bad translation, it's just not necessarily the best. There is a more straightforward translation, and it doesn't actually say rest. So the word translated as rested in this verse is the word Shabbat, or Sabbat. It's where we get the English word Sabbath. And Shabbat doesn't actually mean rest. In its strictest, most literal sense, Shabbat means stop. It just simply means stop. And why it often gets translated as rest is because, yes, that can mean rest. If you're going to rest, you stop whatever you're doing in order to rest. But it doesn't necessarily mean rest. So if I'm walking across this here, rug, I walk, and then when I get here, I could literally say, I Shabbat. I stopped. It doesn't mean I rest, because I'm not resting. I'm going back to actually preach the sermon, but I Shabbated. I actually Shabbat because I simply stopped. And actually in the biblical text, Shabbat is, and I'm not going to go into any examples of this, but it actually is used in this way. There are times when it's not translated as rest at all. It's just translated as stopped or ceased. When something happened and then it stopped, it Shabbat. So if we actually reread Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3, I have a little modified the Roberts Standard Version. No, that's RSV doesn't work because that's actually we're going to go with RAV, Roberts Awesome Version. So this is the Roberts Awesome Version. It says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the hosts of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done. And he stopped on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God stopped from all the work that he had done in creation." So again, we've retranslated it, but the question still remains, why is that so important? Why is it so important that he stopped? Well, to kind of give an illustration of this, I thought best example I can give is recently my wife and I moved. Some of you know, some of you helped. Thank you to all who helped. Daniel, looking at you, and everybody else, Andrew. Very, very, very grateful. But, so, Billy too, didn't forget. But anyways, we moved. And one could say that we created our home. Because, the house existed, but our home did not exist until we moved into it. So we moved. We moved into our home. We created, we prepared our home. But none of that was really the important stuff. The most important part is once the preparation stopped. Because once it stopped, we lived in the home. See, God created the earth. He created the earth as a home for himself and his creation, for himself and his people. And once he stopped creation, that's when the important part started. Because that's when he came to live in creation with his people. Another good way of thinking of it is like a king creating a castle. He creates the castle. He puts a throne in the castle. But once he stops creating, that's when the important part happens, because then he lives in the castle. He sits on the throne. He rests on the throne, might be a better way of putting it. And he rules from his castle. He rules his kingdom and once he stops creating it. So that's really what's being said here. It's not that just that he rested. He created it and then he stopped. And the resting is like he's resting on a throne, or he stopped creation and now he's living in creation with his people. And that's what is being celebrated on the Sabbath the most. The Sabbath is a way to celebrate and every week, every 7 days, it was a way to celebrate the fact that God came to live with his people. And it's interesting to think about, because Sabbath cycle is really artificial. That's not to say that it isn't important, but it is artificial. There's nothing natural in the natural world that says we have to live by a 7-day cycle. Rather, God instituted it. As Jesus said, it was made for man. And it was made for man in order that man could order his entire life around the worship of God. His entire life was lived from one Sabbath to the next Sabbath. Every 7 days, he would worship God. And he would worship the fact that God was living in creation with him. So the Sabbath exists so that man can order his life around worshiping God. It also is a way that as representatives, mankind is supposed to be the image of God, the representatives of God on this earth. As representatives, every 7 days, mankind or Israel is to reenact the fact that God rested on the seventh day and that God rests on his throne. So as his representatives, we reenact that ideal of him coming and resting and ruling the world. And finally, it's also a way that we honor God and we worship him by trusting him. Oh, before I even go to that, as I said, as representatives, we reenact God as king ruling on his throne. So this also points, if we go back to verse 11, I said that in Genesis 2, 1 through 3, rested comes from Shabbat. But there's actually another word that is also translated as resting in the biblical text, and that's actually used in Exodus 20, verse 11. In Exodus 20, verse 11, when it says, "For in 6 days God, the Lord, made the heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the God blessed this Sabbath day and made it holy." The word rested there comes from the Hebrew word Noah, or Noah. And yes, that's where Noah's name comes from. Noah was, which is another interesting thing we can't go into, whole sermon's worth of stuff, that how mankind was saved through rest, Noah. But in this case, Noah, and that has more the connotation in its most literal sense. It means like settling in. Sort of like, if we settle into our house as we've moved in, now we're settling into our house. Or it also could be thought of as like a king settling into his throne. So again, that's what we're every 7 days. And then finally, every 7 days, we are showing that we trust God. So this was especially important in the days of ancient Israel. It's important today, but it's even more important then. They lived in an agricultural society, a subsistence agricultural society, and they literally, they survived by working. And if they didn't work, they didn't have food. So when you take a seventh of your time and you stop work, that's pretty extreme. And you have to trust that God is going to provide for you. And that is what another thing that Sabbath is. It is a statement when you carry it out, when you observe it. It is a statement that you trust God as the ultimate provider more than yourself. So that is one reason, one set of reasons that we celebrate Sabbath. But there is another. So, as I said, the command to observe the Sabbath was given twice. The second time is in Deuteronomy, chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. And here it says, "Observe the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall do labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant, or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and on an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." So why is the reason given here? It's not because God created and rested. It is because you were a slave, and then God delivered you. Therefore, you shall keep the Sabbath. So why is that important? Well, this, instead of pointing the last verse in Exodus, it's pointing to the 6 days of creation, the first chapter and the first 3 verses of the second chapter of Genesis 1. Well, this is actually pointing more towards the rest of chapter 2 in Genesis and the Garden of Eden. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at Genesis 2, verses 8 through 9, 15 through 17. So, and, the bits in between there, 10 through 14, has a lot of good stuff about rivers and geography. Again, great stuff I'd love to go into, but don't have time. Anyways, but verses 8 and 9 and 15 through 17 says, "And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, 'You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die.'" A lot of sh in there. Shall surely die. Okay, anyways, tongue twister. This is important. So, start off, as I said, as we looked at the last verses in Genesis, verses 1 through 3 of chapter 2, we talked about the seventh day. Well, in the 6 days that came before it, each one said there was morning or evening and morning, or morning and evening, and first day, evening and morning, second day, evening and morning, third day, and so on, but not on the seventh day. It never says evening and morning on the seventh day. And the idea is that the seventh day, at least originally, was not supposed to end. The whole time, this time that the Garden of Eden is in, that's during this seventh-day rest. They're experiencing the seventh-day rest then, the ideal of how creation was supposed to be as God was sitting in creation and ruling it. So, as they're sitting there and they're experiencing this, it says that God planted the garden and he placed the man in the garden. And interestingly enough, the man is not to just sit around doing nothing, resting, taking naps all day. He is to actually work it and keep it. But the working, the interesting thing about it is that the word is not the same as work in Deuteronomy. It is, the two words, work it and keep it, actually aren't even gardening terms. They are the same words that were used of priests in the temple as they were serving in the temple. He was to serve God in the garden by working it and keeping it. And the idea is that he had abundance. He had great abundance. He had all the food he needed, all the trees to eat from, everything he needed he had, but his work was not to keep himself alive. It was to glorify God. But in Deuteronomy, when it talks about work in Deuteronomy and also in Exodus, the word used is tabod or tabod. Tabod? No, tabod. I'm bad at pronunciation, but that's the Hebrew word. And it means, it's also the same word that is used for slavery. See, after the garden, when they actually ate of the tree of good and evil, they were expelled, and the curse was that they would eat from the sweat of his brow, that he would have to toil, or tabod, whatever, the ground. And he basically became a slave of the ground. He became a slave of the ground, and so that every 7 days he was to rest from his labor, to remind himself that he was never supposed to be a slave. God is the God of freedom, and his ideal in Eden was freedom and not slavery. So every 7 days we reenact that Eden ideal. We reenact the garden by not slaving to our work. And that is why God told them to remember that they were slaves in Egypt. They were slaves. And every 7 days they are to rest and remember that now they're free. God brought them out and made them free again. And this is also, we can't go into this, but the Sabbath cycle of so many of the festivals, and every 7 years, the Jubilee cycle. This is also what this is getting at. Every 7 years, they would give land back, restore land, restore freedom, let slaves go, all to reenact this Eden ideal of freedom of every human. So that is Sabbath. Circumcision. What was so important about circumcision? Why was that so much a conflict? Well, what was important about it? We won't go too much into this, but circumcision was the sign that you were a Jew. It was something that every Jewish male had to go through. And see, in the diaspora, these Jews who lived as minorities in the Roman and Greek world, in Greek and Roman society, public nudity was actually quite common. Not so much in the sense that you would walk down the street naked, but they would often go to places like gymnasiums or bathhouses where they were naked around other people. So in such situations, it's pretty clear who was and was not a Jew, who were and were not worshipers of Yahweh, because it was obvious. And so these two things, although they seem to be about these obscure rules, they actually get back down to the same core. These are the battles. The core is really, in both instances, why there was such a conflict is that it was about how do we honor and worship God. Sabbath, the conflict over Sabbath was about how to honor and worship God every 7 days. The conflict over circumcision is, are you going to associate yourself with God in public? That's why everybody was so up in arms about these two ideals. And which brings us to our passage today. We're going to start out with the first half of it, Matthew 12, 9 through 14. Oh, there it is. Anyways, yes. He went on from there. and entered their synagogue. And a man was there with a withered hand. And they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So that they might accuse him. He said to them, "Which one of you has a sheep? If it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him, how to destroy him. So, basically, in this instance, Jesus and the Pharisees, they're basically it's a replay of the entire biblical drama. You see, the entire biblical drama could be distilled down to go back straight to the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you don't eat of it, and it's a question of, do you listen to God, or do you choose for yourself what is good and evil? Do you choose to follow God's ways and say, I'm not going to eat of it, I'm going to let God decide for me what is good or evil? Or do I eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, trying to control for myself what is good and evil? So Jesus, we know what side he was on. He allowed God to decide what was good and evil for him. But the Pharisees, they wanted to control for themselves. See, when people choose the knowledge of good and evil, it usually manifests in certain ways. This is what idol worshipers do. We see this in idol worship. So idol worship is interesting because we think of it purely as worshiping something other than God. And yes, that is one aspect, but it's not the only aspect. When in the ancient world, when they made an idol, and I'm going to use this as my example, and no, I am not saying that Oklahoma State is an idol. Absolutely not. How dare. But anyways, when I make an idol, the people in the ancient world, they didn't think this was the actual God. But they made the idol, and they thought this would be a physical body. They thought that God was out here and he was spiritual. But they thought this could be a physical body with which he could interact with the world. So they would make the God, they would place it in the temple, and then they would take this, go through this ceremony where they called the God to the image. And they filled the God's nostrils with breath, which, yes, that should make you think of Genesis. Because, idol, the word for idol in the Old Testament is the same word for image. This is a corruption of this image. So this image, they would call the God to the idol, and then they would feed the idol. They would feed the image. They would give it drink, thinking that the God needed this from the physical form of the God needed this from you. So this was a way, and if you fed it and took care of it, the God would do what you wanted him to do. This was a way to control heaven. And this is one of the reasons why God, Yahweh, never wanted an idol made of him. It's basically saying, you don't control me. You do not tell me where to go. You do not tell me where to come. You don't give me anything that I can't give myself. You don't control me. But idol worshipers, this was a way they controlled heaven. We also see this in the Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel happened in Mesopotamia. Most people thought the highest structures they made were ziggurats. Back in those days, I think it's a ziggurat. Ziggurats, it actually fits with the Tower of Babel story perfectly, because ziggurats were these huge man-made mountains on top of which they put a temple where they thought it was like a portal to heaven. And this was a way they could control where the gods came to earth from. They could control heaven in a way. So, when we choose to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we're not just trying to control our own lives. We often try and control God. And this is what the Pharisees were doing. The Pharisees, in trying to control the Sabbath, were trying to control their own relationship with God. And they were trying not only to control their relationship with God, they were trying to control other people's relationship with God. And then they were trying to control God's response to them, thinking that if they did the right thing, if they carried out the formula, God would do what they wanted. So you had Jesus, who was carrying out God's will. And then you had the Pharisees trying to impose their own will. That's what this is really about. They were trying to take the worship of God, which was pure. This is like Paul saying with the law, they took what was good and they corrupted it into something that was evil. And this is the Pharisees doing the same thing. They took this command to observe the Sabbath, something that was perfect, that was given for man to worship God and respond to God. They took that and they tried to control it, and they tried to use it to control God and to control others. So, and on the other side, you have Jesus. He's using it to do God's will. He is not resting in the sense that he's doing no work, but the work he is doing is not the work of slavery, work that is needed for him to survive, but he is doing the work of a priest, doing good on the Sabbath. So this all comes down back to how we honor and worship God. That's what we can take away from this. I came across this quote from a good book that I was given by a wonderful pastor, that one, from Eugene Peterson. He said that, speaking of worship, he said, Israel and the Christian church insisted that worship was the proclamation of the will of God and the call for human response to it. And this comes back to, basically, Sabbath is for worship. How do we respond to God? How do we respond to who God is in our life? How do we respond to the will of God? And the Pharisees, and when we think of this in our own day, it's what's important about this. It's not just about talking about ancient biblical theology. We got to question, what does this mean for us? And I think I was thinking about this, and I think in the question, how do we honor God, we can come down to two ways, and we can end up following two paths, and both of them can be equally as dangerous, I think. The first of them is rules. We can try and instill rules. This is what the Pharisees did. And the dangers of that, I don't have to go into much. We all kind of know that. We can end up doing the rules for the sake of just doing them. We can end up trying to use those rules to control everybody, control others, control our relationship with God. But the other path, and this is may be surprising, but follow me on this. The other path is too much freedom. See, freedom can become its own idol. Because freedom, the danger of freedom, is apathy. When we think of how, God is the God of freedom, and the best way I can explain how this comes up is, I thought of another story. This is a story I don't admit to often. You may be the only time that I ever admit to this particular fact. But when I was dating my then girlfriend, Sarah, now wife, I was actually, it was before COVID, and if we can remember back that far, back when the world was young, before the Rona, and we worked in these things called offices around other people. We called coworkers. I know it's so quaint nowadays, but we're in the office, we're working, I was working, and Sarah often, once a week, would have an appointment with a life coach. And this life coach was just down the street from my office. So when she would go to her life coach, she would oftentimes stop over for 10, 15 minutes, and we'd just, say hey and connect a little bit. Well, on these days where Sarah would come over, something peculiar happened. See, in the office, I had a friend, a coworker of mine was a good friend, and she, we would, hang out a little bit, and she'd see me throughout the day, and she started realizing that she could tell when Sarah was coming over, even if I never told her. And the reason was, apparently, and I don't admit to this much, but I would dress better and actually try and put more effort into my appearance the days that Sarah would come to the office. It's not that I wasn't professional. I did dress professionally, but I just dressed nicer professionally on the days Sarah would come. And so she would see me, and automatically she'd just start smiling and laughing, and she'd be like, Sarah's coming over today, isn't she? And I'd be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But she was, of course, always right. But the truth is, it's not because I had to. I had freedom in my relationship with Sarah. I look nice. I would never say I look nicer than her, because I never do. Sarah always looks nicer and prettier than I do. But sometimes I would even be more formally dressed than Sarah was when she would come by. And it's not like if I didn't dress up quite as much, Sarah would stop loving me. But it came down to more something like this. On the priority scale, my coworkers were somewhere down here. Sarah was somewhere up here. So my coworkers got coworker effort. Sarah got girlfriend, or more accurately, love of my life effort. It was a choice I made. This was a response not to rule, not something I had to do, but just a response, despite the freedom that I had, this was a response to simply who she was in my life. So I guess the question is, if coworkers are here, get coworker effort, wife now, and still love of my life, is here, gets love of my life effort, does God get God effort? When we have freedom, sometimes we can let it become apathy. And we forget that God is still God. God is king. Another way of putting this, thinking about this is, again, I'm not the only man with a husband here. No, we are not that church. I'm not the only man with a wife here. Many husbands here have wives, and you probably have pretty free relationships. But you very well know that you can't just say anything you want to your wife. There are certain ways you do not speak to your wife. And wives, the same thing with your husband. There are just certain ways that I may speak to my friends, my coworkers, even you. I love all of you, coworkers, church, but Sarah's still up here. And as much as I love you, as much as your family, there are ways that I will talk to you, I will treat you, that I will never treat Sarah. I will never talk to Sarah. And do we act the same way towards God? Another way of thinking of this is children with their parents. Children are some of the most important people, maybe the most important person to their parent. They're the most beloved. But that doesn't mean they speak however they want to their parent. There's still a level of respect there. Still certain things that they don't say, not because of rules so much as If the rules exist not to be a rule, but because of who the parent is in their life. God's the same way, you know. God's our God. He's our King. We can, and honestly, I'm as bad about this as anybody. This is not I hear my heart. I am not judging anything, anyone, anybody, how they act. This is as much me as anything. I know in my own life I have been encouraged by others and have followed through in speaking to God in certain ways that I wouldn't speak to my boss. And it's not that I don't, that I like my boss. Even if I like my boss and he's my friend, I would never speak to him in certain ways just because he's my boss at my company. Do I treat God the same way? And so it comes down to that choice. This isn't about a morality police. And again, another point I want to make is that this isn't about comparing ourselves to other people. One of the bad things about, when we instill too many rules, it's too one size fits all. It's not the same for everybody. We're in different situations. I don't live the same way even Jesus lived 2,000 years ago. We act different ways. Respect looks differently in our culture than it did in his. That is fair. I think God does take that into account. But, and I go back to that story about me and Sarah, When she came by, I dressed better, not compared to other people, because Lord knows that wasn't always the truth. And it wasn't, there might be people in this world who thought I was putting in too much effort, that it was just not necessary. There might be other people who would think, I was being way too casual. There are places in this world where dressing up on a date would mean nothing less than like a suit and tie. And I was not that, certainly. But it wasn't about those things. When my friend knew that Sarah was coming over, when she recognized the effort I was putting forth, she wasn't comparing me to others. She was comparing Robert to Robert. She knew how I acted when Sarah wasn't coming. And she could then tell the difference in effort. So the question is, and this is a question that really none of us can answer for you, only you can answer for yourself, is your effort towards God different than your effort towards others? Do you treat God differently than you treat your, other humans? And that, that'll look different for all of us. When we think about what's the consequence of this, and for that, I want to go on to the last part of our passage here. In Matthew 12, verses 15 through 21, it says, Jesus, aware of this is after he healed the guy and the Pharisees wanted to destroy him. It says, Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there, and many followed him, and he healed them all and ordered them not to make him known. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel, or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not quench, until he brings justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope. So this is a great passage, quote of Isaiah 42, 40-somethings, others. First servant song, another great passage. Whole sermon could be preached. Don't have the time now. Anyways, but and there are many things that could be said, but I wanted to focus in on one thing it says. It says, he will not quarrel or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not quench. So when it's saying that, it's basically saying, at least on this earth, as the servant is here on this earth, he's not going to condemn anybody now. He's not going to quarrel. He's not going to bring conflict. He's going to present himself. When it says he's not going to cry out in the streets, it means you won't hear him arguing. It won't mean you won't hear his raised voice. He's going to put his voice out there, and you'll either follow him or you won't. So basically, Jesus will not force himself, and he will not force his ways upon any of us yet. And the truth is, we have the freedom, and he wants us to freely respond to him now. But the warning in that, the warning for all those who have freedom, is to remember that, yes, we have freedom, but we will stand before him one day, and we will be asked to answer for our lives. And you don't have to justify yourself to me. I'm not your morality police. Neither is Andrew, neither is Dinah, neither is anybody. And anybody who tries, they're just being oppressive. That doesn't mean that, that doesn't mean there isn't a right way and a wrong way, I guess is the way of putting it. So we're just going to have a bit of meditation. I want you to spend some time with the Holy Spirit. I want you to consider a few questions. First off, do you order your life around worship of God? How do you respond to God as your King, as your Creator, as the ruler of the universe? And finally, do your actions towards God show honor? So.